Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to go over UV mapping your models. So I've got my finished axe here. It is nice and clean. I have deleted the history with this button up here. And I'm going to next move on to the UV mapping stage. So to start UV mapping, we're going to open up our UV editor by going up to UV editor. And it should open up this menu, and you'll see it is a 2D grid. And if you have your model selected, you should see something that looks like this chaos. It's a lot to take in at first, but that's okay. We are going to untangle this rather quickly. So basically, a UV map is where we take our model and divide it into a bunch of flat shapes, which then tell the software where to place the textures on the 3D model. So think of it as kind of like clothes making in reverse. When you make a shirt, you design a flat pattern and cut out several different shapes, and you design where the seams are going to go, and then you cut out your fabric along the pattern, and then you sew the fabric together along your chosen seams, and then you come out with a 3D object like a shirt. Think of that in reverse. We're starting with our 3D object and we are cutting it down into a pattern. And then it uses that pattern to put the textures onto the 3D model. So to get us started, we're going to go ahead and create new UV maps because these ones are a mess. To do that, make sure your model is selected, and then you can go up to here and hit create. And we have several different options for making new UV maps. Most often, you're going to go ahead and just use the automatic option, and it will just do its best to give you as many flat shapes as possible based on your model. So now, as you can see, while we have our UV editor open, we have two different kinds of lines shown to us. We have our regular lines, which are displayed in blue, and then we have these thick white lines. These white lines are seams. These seams are the divisions of the model in the UV editor. So in the UV editor, we have these different pieces of separate geometry called shells. You can select shells with the shell selection mode, either by holding right click and going to here, or clicking here. As you can see, the white lines make up the borders of the shells. So if I wanted to, say, divide up a shell, I could select these edges, and I can go over to here and hit cut, and it creates a new seam. In other words, it creates a new division in the shell, and I can separate these. Now notice that on my actual geometry, it didn't create a separation in the actual physical geometry. It's only in the pattern or the UV map that it made a separation. So changes to the UVs do not make changes to your model. If we want to see how a texture would look on our model before we've actually made our materials, we can go ahead and go up to this button and hit checker map, and it turns on a temporary texture. And this is a really good way to see what your UV map is actually doing to your model. If we go in and move around one of these shells, you could really see how the texture is applying. Now you may notice on all the seams, the texture doesn't line up perfectly. So these seams look pretty bad, and we really don't want to have a lot of these showing on our final model. So when we are UV mapping and editing our UV maps, it is our job to make as few seams as possible while not stretching out the texture on our model. So how do I get rid of these seams? Because there's a total of 4 separate divisions of this handle, when I think I can get away with one. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my edge mode. I'm going to get really close. I can see I've got very tiny edges up here. I want to get those two. I'm going to click one there, and click down here, double click to select the whole loop. And notice, because these are the same edge on both of these shells, it selects both sides. And then what I'm going to do from there is I'm going to select Stitch Together, and that removes the seam and places the shells together, like so. And I'm going to keep doing that. Stitch together. Just like that. Stitch together. Right, and now I've got one single shell. However, I'm not particularly happy with where the seam is. And I can't totally get rid of the seam, because I could go and do this. Do stitch together. But what's going to happen now is that's going to cause a problem on my texture. And that's even worse than a seam. This right here. Because now that's super crunched together. If you look, now those faces are overlapping with these faces, and it's being stretched out over a much farther distance than the other ones. So how do we solve this problem if I have to have a seam somewhere? Well, generally, I like to have my seams in the middle, first of all. So I'm going to select this edge, go up to here, select this edge, I'm going to go over to here and hit cut. And then over here, grab this edge, double click to select them all there, and hit stitch together. So now I've got a seam right in the middle where it is, I think, best hidden. Your job is always to hide your seams as best you can. It's a little bit hard on a handle like this, but I think that this is the best spot for it. And then from here, I need to clean up the shape of this a little bit, because it's still a little bit wonky. These squares aren't as straight as I would like them to be. So I have a couple of options for cleaning up my UV shell. I can go down here and I could hit unfold. And what unfold does is it basically calculates how to unfold the whole shell in a way that is very even. I could also hit optimize. Optimize is a similar function, but it is attempting to get the least stretching as possible. And so now these shells look a lot more straight, but this natural curvature is still not exactly what I want. So my third option is I could hit straighten UVs, and it lines them up into a perfect grid. So now if I turn my checkerboard back on, all of my squares are very straight and going along the curvature of the handle as I would expect them to. There is still a seam, but it is a lot less noticeable. So while I can leave it like this with one seam on one side, I could also take another approach where I go ahead and select all the edges of this shell on the other side, and then I can go and cut it. So I get two shells of equal size. And if I go to transform, I can flip one of them, and then I will select both of them. go down here to arrange and layout, and I'll hit stack shells. And what that does is it takes both of my shells and puts them directly on top of each other. And then if I turn on my checkerboard, you can see that the textures are now completely symmetrical on both sides. So now, if I adjust this just right, I may be able to completely hide my seams, depending on the texture I place on this. I'm going to go ahead and move my UV editor over here, because it actually would be a little bit easier if I was working like this. Now I can see a little bit more. So this portion is okay, but as you can see, some of these shells have two sides, and some of these shells have one side. And so the shape of each side is getting a little bit distorted when it's two combined. So I'm going to go ahead and go into edge mode, double click, and cut. Do the same on this one. I'll select all of these, and I will hit unfold. And now these are all going to have an equal shape. There should be no distortion going on. Luckily, my axe head came out pretty close to how I want it in my UV editor. The inside of this came out as a separate piece of the outside, but that's fine. I like the way that is. However, it did leave me with these strips, which are too small, I think, to really justify being their own separate shells. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these and I'm going to stitch them into this shell. So all I need to do that is I'm going to double click here to select the whole edge loop around the shell. I'm going to go over here to stitch together. And it made them pretty wonky, but all I have to do then is go to unfold. And that looks pretty good. Let me see if Optimize looks any better. I actually do like Optimize a bit better. I can do the same thing to the other side. Hit edge. Stitch together. I'm going to unfold it and optimize. I did it 3 times on this side, and I'd like to stack these. Go up to transform. Go down to flip. And then I'm going to go down to align and layout, and I'm going to hit stack shells. Oops. Stack shells. So my axe head is looking pretty good so far in the UVs, but I have run into a bit of a problem. The UVs in the middle here are not perfectly symmetrical, even though the mesh is symmetrical, and I'm struggling to get the shells to be symmetrical. So what do? Well, I could keep fussing with the UVs, or I could delete one half and then take the other half and mirror it with the mirror tool, and it pops back onto the other side. And then if you look over here in the UV editor, you'll notice that I now have perfectly symmetrical UVs. So sometimes you'll get these corners where they are connected by one vertice, and you try to stitch them together and it doesn't do anything. Sometimes stitch together just won't work, and instead you need to use the sew tool. The sew tool works similarly to stitch together in that it combines 2 seams and gets rid of the seam. But the main difference is that it will move around your UVs in the UV editor and stretch them around instead of moving the shells around. So if you find yourself tired of the method of clicking edges and then sewing them or cutting them, you could also try going up to UV and hit the 3D cut and sew UV tool, and that will basically let you do it all in one go. So if you drag along these edges. It will make a seam. And go all the way down. And if I don't like that, I can hold control and it'll sew my edges together. Now, sew and stitch together are different. If you sew edges together, it won't snap the shells together. So if I try to sew together seams, which have really far apart shells, watch what happens. It stresses them out right at the end. And that can have some really unintended consequences. So this is really a lot better for making new seams and not necessarily good for sewing up seams. Once you've gone over your whole model, it should look something like this in your editor, making sure to hide as many of your seams as possible. I've gone ahead and done a lot of mirrors, so as you can see, this side is the same as this side. Same here. There's no one true best way to do this though, so you're kind of going on your instincts here on just how to best hide your seams and make it just as smooth as possible. I'm going to turn on my checkered mode one more time. And I can see, yeah, for the most part, this is all looking pretty good. But you may notice on your model in some areas where the squares may be smaller or larger in some places as opposed to other places. So say if I make one UV shell pretty small, the texture will look really big on it. And I just don't want that lack of uniformity. I want my texture to be pretty evenly sized throughout the whole thing. But it can be hard to ensure that it's all the same size. So what I can do if I want to make the scale of all of my UVs uniform is I can select one of my shells and I can go over to the transform tab and I can go down here to the bottom and select textile density get. And what that does is it enters basically the size of these UVs into this box here. I can set a value of my own, but I'm going to leave it at what I got from this UV shell. And now I'm going to marquee select all of these shells and I'm going to hit set. And it's going to take a minute to think. And then what that's done is it has resized all of my shells to match the exact scale of this one. So not many of them changed, but a few of them did. Most notably this one that I had scaled earlier. And so now I can be sure they're all the same size. So now that I have all of my pieces and I've ensured that they're all the same size, the last step for me to do is layout. And the goal with layout is I want to take up as much of my 0 to 1 space as possible without going outside of it, because that will take more memory if there's anything outside of the 0 to 1 scale on the grid. And I want to group these in a way that will help me out when I am texturing. So how you group these might depend on your end goal for this. So if you were working on a game prop, for example, you would go ahead and make this one material and then paint in your wood and metal and different materials all into one texture. And then you would want to make sure there is no overlap of anything that isn't explicitly supposed to be mirrored. So like my axe head, both sides of this are the same, and that's fine that they're overlapping, but I wouldn't want these overlapping with this UV, or this UV shell, which is my handle. Because then if I have my wood texture in this spot, then the wood texture is going to end up on here. If you are working with multiple materials, then it's okay if you want to have everything from one material overlap with anything from another material. So say I had all of my metal parts, say these are all the metal parts, these would be okay to overlap with, say, the handle, because they're going to be using different textures and the overlap isn't going to interfere with each other. So for clarity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and just lay everything out so that there's no overlap of different kinds of shells. I am going to try and group these by material, however, and I'm not going to worry too much about the specifics of the layout. I'm not going to make it too tight for now because I know I'm going to make changes later as I start applying materials. But I just want to get it left the same. I want to roughly group by type. So I'm going to put all my blades in one spot over here. I'm going to stick parts of the handle next to each other here. Maybe put my crystal parts next to each other. And there we go. I've got everything roughly grouped together in a way that makes sense to me. How you group them is really up to you. There's no like perfectly right way to group them, but it helps if like kinds are grouped together. And then I'm not going to worry too much about how these are spaced right now because I'm ultimately going to change these as I start to apply textures that I find from the internet. But for now, I'm going to leave them as is and then just scale them up so I'm taking a little more advantage of the space. Maybe slide these in a bit. It doesn't matter that I'm making them bigger because they're all still the same size. And there, that's good enough for now. I'm going to move on to texturing in the next video, and we will come back to these and change them around one more time. But that should be good enough for now. Now, like I said, I'm going to manually be moving these around once I get to texturing. But if it's too much of a hassle to be moving them around manually, you could also go down to here and arrange and layout. And you could select all these and then you could hit layout. And what that'll do is it will go through all your shells and scale them up to as big as it can make them and pack them as tightly as it can so you can get as much texture as you can out of your UVs. The downside to this, though, is that all that work we did to overlap certain parts of it is now undone. So if you have overlapping shells, you could just come back in and manually move them together and stack them. That's fine. But now you've got all this space here you need to account for, and you might just end up doing more work again. So the layout is good for a quick job, but it's not going to be a perfect job. One more thing. If you find it too difficult to work from the automatic shells that it gives you, there is another approach to this. You could start by selecting all your edges and then going down or going over here to sew. And you sew them all together into one big piece. And then what you can do is you can start by just making your seams from one piece. So then I can go in here, select that, make a cut. Cut from there all the way up to here. Cut. And cut. And then I can go to UV shell mode and select this shell right here. And it looks really bad right now, but then I can go down to unfold, and I've now got a good shell. And so that's another perfectly good method of tackling this problem of UV mapping, is you can start from one big piece and cut out the parts you want. It really depends on your model. Most of the time it's going to be easier to start with the automatic shells like so. But some models, it just does not interpret it well, and it's easier to start from one big piece. So, in the next video, I'm going to move on to texturing. We're going to come back to this and continue to move these around, but overall, these are pretty much done. So, I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.